Say it in French. Or don't say it at all. The laughter came first, sharp and effortless, echoing across the rooftop like it belonged there, like it had been rehearsed, like everyone in the room had already agreed on who mattered and who didn't, and for a brief second the city itself seemed to pause beneath the glass walls of Manhattan's most exclusive dining floor, 80 stories above the noise, where deals were measured in hundreds of millions and silence was just another form of power, and at the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, billionaire CEO, tailored suit cut to perfection, voice smooth with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned, never being corrected, never being told no. His fingers resting lightly on the edge of a crystal glass as he leaned back just enough to let the moment breathe, just enough to let the room orbit him, and across from him investors nodded, partners smiled, and assistants took mental notes they would never write down, because in rooms like this nothing was forgotten, only stored, and moving quietly between them, unnoticed yet unavoidable, was Naomi Brooks, her posture straight, her steps measured, her presence dismissed before it was ever acknowledged, a black waitress in a pressed uniform carrying a tray of imported wine that cost more than her monthly rent, her eyes steady, her expression neutral, her voice unused, because no one had asked for it, not yet, not here, not in a room where language itself had become a weapon, where Ethan had just shifted effortlessly into French, his accent polished enough to impress, his tone casual enough to diminish, as if switching languages was nothing more than a parlor trick, as if meaning only mattered when he delivered it, and when Naomi approached to refill his glass, he didn't look at her, not really, he looked through her, past her, like she was part of the furniture, like she existed only to complete the illusion of luxury, and then he said it, not loudly, not angrily, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to filter his thoughts. You probably don't understand a word of this anyway. And the table responded exactly how he expected, a few chuckles, a smirk, a glance exchanged between men who believed they were witnessing something harmless, something normal, something beneath consequence. But Naomi didn't flinch, she didn't rush, she didn't correct him, she simply poured, the deep red liquid catching the warm amber light as it filled the glass, steady, controlled, precise, her silence not empty but deliberate, because what no one in that room realized, what Ethan Caldwell couldn't possibly have calculated, was that every word he had spoken, every syllable he had used to draw a line between himself and her, had already been understood, processed, and quietly placed where it belonged. And as the laughter faded and the conversation continued to drift across languages like a display of power, something shifted, subtle at first, almost invisible, the kind of shift you don't notice until it's already too late. Because Naomi Brooks was no longer just serving the table, she was listening. And in a room built on dominance, listening was the most dangerous position of all. The conversation did not stop, it evolved, sliding from one language to another like a performance designed to impress rather than communicate. And Ethan leaned forward again, this time switching to Italian, his voice carrying just enough volume to be overheard, just enough arrogance to remind everyone who was in control. And across the table a venture partner responded in kind, the exchange smooth, rehearsed, almost theatrical, while Naomi moved between them with the same quiet precision, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, her presence still dismissed, still categorized as background, but her attention sharpened with every word, every accent, every subtle mistake that no one else seemed to notice, because in rooms like this people did not listen for truth, they listened for status, and status was loud, confident, and often wrong. And as the conversation shifted again, this time into Japanese, slower, less certain, Ethan's tone changed just slightly, the rhythm uneven, the pronunciation close but not exact, and it was enough, just enough to reveal that what he presented as mastery was actually performance, and Naomi heard it clearly, not as an observer, but as someone who knew the difference between fluency and imitation, between speaking to be understood and speaking to be admired, and still she said nothing, not yet, because timing mattered more than truth, and truth delivered too early was often ignored. But then came the moment, small and almost invisible, when one of the investors asked a question in Japanese, a real question, not rehearsed, not performative, something about regulatory approval timelines in Osaka, something specific, something that required understanding, and Ethan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but in a room like this, a fraction was enough, his smile holding, his eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared to respond. And that was when Naomi stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a pause, a stillness that broke her pattern of motion, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table as she looked not at Ethan, but at the investor. Her voice calm, even and unmistakably fluent as she answered the question directly, clearly, without hesitation. Her Japanese precise, natural, effortless, the kind that did not need to prove itself because it simply was, and for a moment no one reacted, not because they did not hear her, but because their minds had not yet caught up to what had just happened, the shift too subtle, too unexpected, and then the silence began, spreading outward from the center of the table like a ripple. Conversations fading, movements slowing, eyes turning first toward Naomi, then toward Ethan and back again, as if the room itself was trying to reconcile two versions of reality, one where power dictated voice, and one where voice had just rewritten power, and Naomi did not raise her tone, did not add emphasis, did not seek attention, she simply finished the sentence, placed the wine bottle back on her tray, and stepped back into stillness, but it was no longer the same stillness because now, it carried weight, now it carried presence, now it demanded recognition, and Ethan, for the first time that evening, did not speak immediately, his glass untouched, his expression controlled but no longer effortless, because the room was no longer orbiting him, it was waiting, and it was no longer clear who it was waiting for. No one moved right away, not because they were unsure of what they had just heard, but because acknowledging it would mean admitting something far more uncomfortable than a simple mistake. It would mean admitting that the hierarchy they had silently agreed upon had just been disrupted by someone they had already decided did not belong in the conversation, and Ethan felt it before he fully understood it, the shift in attention, the subtle redirection of energy, the way the investor who had asked the question was now looking past him, not rudely, not deliberately, but instinctively, as if recalibrating, as if searching for the most reliable source in the room, and Naomi did not step forward. She did not claim the space, she simply remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but her presence now undeniable, and that was the difference because power that needs to announce itself is fragile, but power that reveals itself quietly is difficult to ignore. And Ethan cleared his throat, a small sound, controlled, calculated, the kind of reset he had used countless times in boardrooms and negotiations, and he smiled again, but this time the smile had weight to it, effort behind it, as he responded in English, redirecting the conversation back to familiar ground, back to numbers, projections, timelines, things he could control, things that did not challenge his authority, and for a moment it worked, the room followed, the rhythm returned, the illusion reassembled itself piece by piece, but something had changed beneath the surface, something that could not be unseen, and when another investor, older, more observant, spoke next, he did not address Ethan first. He glanced at Naomi, just briefly, just enough to signal awareness, before asking a follow-up question, this time in German, precise and technical, and again there was that fraction of a second, that hesitation, that invisible pause where Ethan calculated his response, and again Naomi answered, just as calmly, just as clearly, her German. Crisp, structured, effortless, not louder, not faster, just accurate. And the room reacted differently this time, not with silence but with recognition, a few exchanged looks, a raised eyebrow, a subtle shift in posture, because now it was no longer an accident, no longer a coincidence, it was a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the side of his glass, a habit he had when processing new variables, new risks, new threats. And for the first time that evening, Naomi Brooks was no longer invisible to him, not as a server, not as background, but as a factor, an unexpected one. And in a world where control was everything, the unexpected was the only thing he truly disliked. And yet Naomi did not challenge him, she did not interrupt, she did not even look at him directly, she continued her work, moving to the next table, adjusting a plate, refilling a glass as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but the room no longer saw her the same way, because once you recognize value, you cannot unsee it, and as the city lights flickered beyond the glass walls, reflecting against polished surfaces and quiet ambition, the balance of the room had already begun to tilt, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built an empire on reading people, was now realizing, perhaps too late, that he had completely misread the one person who had said the least. The room did not return to what it was, it adjusted, subtly at first, like a system recalibrating after a fault it could not ignore. And conversations that once flowed toward Ethan now moved with caution, with curiosity, with a new variable quietly inserted into every exchange, and Naomi continued her work without interruption, her steps measured, her presence controlled, but now every movement carried a different weight, because recognition had replaced assumption, and in a space built on perception that alone was enough to shift influence, And Ethan felt it in the pauses between responses, in the way questions were now framed, in the glances that no longer settled on him first, and for a man who had built his reputation on command, on certainty, on being the most informed voice in any room, uncertainty was not just unfamiliar, it was unacceptable, so he adapted, because that was what he did best. He leaned forward again, posture tightening slightly, his tone sharpening just enough to reclaim authority, and this time he spoke in Mandarin, more carefully than before, more deliberate, choosing words he knew, phrases he had practiced, constructing sentences that sounded strong even if they lacked depth, and he directed the statement toward a partner seated near the end of the table, someone known for precision, someone who would recognize weakness if it was there, and for a moment it seemed like control had returned, the rhythm steady again, the attention realigning. But Naomi heard the gaps, the subtle misplacement of tone, the structure that almost held but did not fully land, and she paused once more, not immediately, not impulsively, but with the same deliberate timing that had defined every move she made that evening. And when she spoke, her Mandarin was not louder, not faster, but cleaner, more natural, the cadence smooth, the meaning exact, and this time she did not just answer, she refined, adjusting a term, clarifying a nuance, completing the thought in a way that revealed not just understanding but mastery, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic but undeniable, the kind of shift that settles into the room rather than interrupts it. And the partner nodded, not to Ethan but to Naomi, a small gesture, professional, respectful, but powerful in its implication, and that was the moment Ethan understood that this was no longer about a single exchange, no longer about a momentary surprise. This was a pattern he could not control, a presence he had not accounted for, and the room knew it too, because influence had begun to move, not in declarations, not in announcements but in attention, and attention is where power begins, and Naomi, without raising her voice, without stepping out of her role, had become the most reliable voice in a room full of certainty. And Ethan leaned back slowly, his fingers no longer tapping, his glass still untouched, as he watched her for the first time with full awareness, not as background, not as staff, but as someone who had quietly rewritten the rules of the evening. And outside the glass walls the city continued to glow, unaware that inside, without noise, without conflict, without spectacle, the balance of power had already changed. By the time the next course arrived, the room no longer felt like a stage controlled by one man. It felt like a negotiation in motion, something alive, something shifting beneath the polished surface of fine glassware and quiet wealth, and Ethan understood that ignoring it would only make it worse, so he changed his approach, not abruptly, not obviously, but with the kind of calculated precision that had built his empire. He turned slightly in his seat, his gaze finally settling on Naomi not as an afterthought but as a point of interest, and when he spoke this time, his voice carried something new, not humility, not yet, but awareness. "You seem to have quite the ear for language," he said, the words measured, the tone controlled, an attempt to reframe the narrative without surrendering authority, and for the first time that evening, the room watched not what he said, but how she would respond, because power had shifted just enough to make her answer matter. And Naomi paused, not out of hesitation but intention, setting the bottle down gently, her hands steady, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and unmistakably composed. "It is not about hearing, sir, it is about listening." And the sentence landed with a weight that did not need volume, because it carried truth, and truth in a room like this does not echo, it settles. And a few of the guests exchanged glances, subtle but meaningful, the kind that signaled understanding without words, and Ethan nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging the statement while still holding his position, but inside he was recalculating, because this was no longer a situation he could dominate through presence alone. This required strategy, adaptation, and for a brief moment he considered shifting the focus entirely, redirecting the conversation away from language, away from anything that gave her an advantage. But the room had already moved past that option, because curiosity had taken hold, and curiosity once sparked is difficult to suppress, and one of the investors leaned forward, a slight smile forming. "How many languages do you speak?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as genuine inquiry, and Naomi did not rush to answer. She did not list them like achievements, she simply said, "Enough to understand what is being said, even when it is not meant for me." And there it was. Not just intelligence, not just skill, but awareness, the kind that sees beyond words into intention, and the room absorbed it, the implication settling deeper than any display of fluency could, because this was no longer about language, it was about perception, about who truly understood the dynamics unfolding at the table, and Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, his fingers now resting still against the glass, because he recognized something he had not expected to encounter that night. Not competition, not opposition, but clarity, and clarity is dangerous when it does not belong to you. And Naomi, without stepping out of her role, without raising her voice, had become the clearest presence in the room, and for the first time since the evening began, Ethan Caldwell was no longer certain he was the one defining the conversation. The question did not fade after it was answered. It lingered, settling into the room like a quiet pressure that no one could ignore, because now, everyone was no longer just observing Naomi, they were recalibrating around her, adjusting their expectations, their assumptions, their sense of who held value in that space, and Ethan could see it clearly, not in any dramatic gesture, but in the smallest changes, the way people angled their bodies slightly toward her when she moved, the way their eyes followed her not out of curiosity anymore but out of recognition, and recognition was the one thing he had always controlled, the one currency he had mastered, and now it was shifting beyond him, not taken, not challenged, but simply redirected, and that made it more unsettling because there was nothing to push against, nothing to confront, only something to understand. And Ethan Caldwell was not a man who ignored patterns. He studied them, he dissected them, and then he used them, and so he made a decision, quiet, immediate, precise. He would not compete with her. He would redefine the frame, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, not louder, not softer, but more deliberate. "Where did you learn all of this?" He asked, the question simple, but the intention behind it layered, because this was no longer about language, it was about origin, about context, about finding a way to place her back into a category he could understand. And Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, not because she needed time to think, but because she understood exactly what the question was trying to do, and when she answered, her voice remained steady, unshaken. "Public libraries, online courses, conversations with people who did not expect me to understand them." And there was no pride in her tone, no performance, just fact, just truth presented without decoration, and that made it land harder than any display of achievement could, because it removed the distance, it removed the illusion that what she possessed was inaccessible, and instead revealed something far more unsettling, that the difference between them was not opportunity alone, but perspective, and the room absorbed it, quietly, deeply, because it challenged something unspoken, something foundational, and one of the guests leaned back slightly, exhaling as if processing more than just information, because in that moment the narrative shifted again, not from surprise to admiration, but from admiration to reflection, and Ethan felt it, the weight of it, the way the room was no longer just evaluating her, but re-evaluating everything that had led to this moment. And he nodded slowly, not as a gesture of control, but as acknowledgement, because denying it would only weaken his position further, and for the first time that evening, his expression lost its effortless certainty, replaced by something more complex, something more human. And Naomi, without changing her stance, without stepping forward or back, remained exactly where she had always been. But now the room had moved toward her, not physically but in understanding, in attention, in respect, and in a space where influence was measured not by who spoke the most, but by who was truly heard. Naomi Brooks had become the center without ever asking for it, and Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built his world on being the most important voice in any room, was now listening. The air in the room had changed, not in a way that could be measured, not in a way that could be announced, but in a way that every person present could feel without needing to explain it, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be reversed simply by returning to numbers or contracts or polished presentations. And for a few seconds no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were choosing their words more carefully now, aware that language itself had become something more than a tool, it had become a mirror, and Naomi stood within that silence as she always had, composed, grounded, her presence no longer blending into the background but anchoring the moment. And Ethan watched her, not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with calculation refined by respect, the kind that does not come easily to men who are used to being the most capable person in every room. And yet here he was, adjusting, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, and that adjustment showed in the way he spoke next, slower, more intentional. "If you understand this much," he said, his voice steady but no longer performative, "then you also understand what is at stake tonight." And it was not a challenge, not exactly, it was an acknowledgement disguised as a statement, and Naomi met it with the same calm clarity she had carried all evening. "I understand what is being said, and what is not being said." she replied, and the distinction landed immediately because in high-level negotiations, what is not said often carries more weight than what is spoken, and a few of the investors shifted in their seats, recognizing the precision of that observation, recognizing that she was not just translating words, she was interpreting intention, and that was a different level of intelligence entirely, and Ethan nodded once slowly, his gaze steady now, no longer searching for a way to contain her, but beginning to recognize the value of what she brought into the room, and value when identified correctly changes everything. And one of the partners leaned forward, his interest no longer hidden. "Then tell me," he said, his tone respectful, measured. "What are we missing?" And the question did not feel like a test, it felt like an invitation, and the room leaned in, not physically but mentally, emotionally, because now they were not waiting to observe, they were waiting to learn. And Naomi did not rush, she did not perform, she simply spoke, her voice even, her words precise. "You are all speaking about expansion, about speed, about market dominance," she said, her eyes moving across the table, not avoiding anyone, not targeting anyone, just seeing. "But none of you are addressing the cultural friction that will slow it down, the regulatory hesitation that will delay it, or the trust that has not yet been earned." And the room absorbed it in silence, not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of realization, because what she had just done was not correct a sentence, not refine a phrase, she had reframed the entire conversation, and Ethan felt it fully now, not as a loss of control, but as the introduction of clarity that had been missing, and for the first time that evening, he did not try to redirect, he did not try to reclaim the narrative, he listened completely, and Naomi, still standing where she began, had moved the entire room without taking a single step. No one interrupted her, not because they agreed immediately, but because what she said could not be dismissed as easily as everything that came before. It did not rely on tone or status or presentation, it relied on accuracy, and accuracy has a way of cutting through even the most polished environments without raising its voice. And the room held that silence again, but this time it was different. It was not shock, it was processing, and the investors were no longer looking at Ethan for confirmation. They were looking at each other, recalculating timelines, reassessing risks, quietly acknowledging that the conversation had just shifted from performance to substance, and Ethan remained still, his posture composed, his expression controlled, but inside something had already changed, not broken, not shaken, but adjusted, because he recognized the rare moment when resisting clarity would cost more than accepting it, and he turned slightly toward Naomi, not as a gesture of authority but as a recognition of relevance. "Then what would you do differently?" he asked, and the question was no longer layered with intent to categorize or contain, it was direct, open, and for the first time that evening, it carried something close to respect, and Naomi did not hesitate, not because she was eager to answer, but because she had already been thinking 3 steps ahead. The way people do when they are used to being unheard, when they learn to prepare before they are invited, and she spoke with the same steady tone, the same measured clarity. "I would slow down the expansion and invest in local partnerships first," she said, her gaze moving across the table, meeting eyes without challenging them, "not just to comply with regulations but to build trust before scale, because without trust, speed becomes risk, and risk at this level does not stay quiet." And the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not disruptive, not dramatic but directional, because now she was not just identifying what was missing, she was offering a path forward. And that is where influence becomes undeniable, and one of the senior partners leaned back slightly, nodding once slowly, as if aligning with something he had not yet put into words himself, and another began to take notes discreetly, almost instinctively, because when clarity appears, people respond even if they do not say it out loud, and Ethan watched it happen, not with resistance but with focus, because this was no longer about maintaining control of the room, it was about understanding how to move with it. And for the first time that evening he was no longer leading from assumption, he was adapting to reality, and Naomi, still standing in the same place she had begun, had moved from being overlooked to being heard, to now quietly shaping the direction of a conversation worth hundreds of millions of dollars, without ever raising her voice, without ever stepping outside her role. And in a room where power had always been measured by who spoke the loudest, something far more powerful had taken its place, the ability to be right when it mattered most. The room did not erupt into applause, there was no dramatic reaction, no sudden shift in volume, because moments like this did not need noise to confirm their impact. They settled, deeply and quietly, into the decisions that would follow, and one by one the investors began to speak again. But this time their words carried a different tone, less certainty, more consideration. Questions that were no longer directed only at Ethan but open to the table, to the idea, to the clarity that had just been introduced, and Ethan listened fully now, not as the dominant voice, but as a participant in something that had grown beyond his control and into something better, something more accurate. And that realization did not weaken him, it refined him, because true power is not in never being challenged, it is in recognizing when the right voice enters the room. And he turned toward Naomi once more, not with performance, not with calculation, but with something simpler, something rarer in spaces. Like this acknowledgement, "Thank you," he said, the words direct, unadorned, and for a brief second the entire room understood the weight behind them, because they were not just gratitude, they were recognition, and Naomi nodded once, gently, not as acceptance of praise, but as closure of a moment that was never about validation, and she reached for the tray again, lifting it with the same steady hands, the same composed posture, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had, and the conversation continued, but now it carried her influence within it, her perspective woven into decisions that would move markets, shape timelines, and define outcomes far beyond that room. And no one asked her to stay, no one offered her a seat, but they did not need to, because her impact had already taken its place at the table. And Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than usual, watching as she moved away. Not disappearing into the background as she had before, but leaving behind a presence that could not be removed. And he understood something then, something simple and undeniable, that the most valuable voice in the room is not always the one that speaks first, or the loudest, or the most often, but the one that sees clearly when others cannot. And as the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass, reflecting ambition, wealth, and the illusion of control, one truth remained, quiet but absolute. He had the power to command the room. But tonight, she had the power to change it.